So we're in your American history, chapter 20, section 2, settling in the West. And you see how the settlers are coming forth and how the railways would bring in new people interested in settling the West, even from Europe. So we'll see how these railroad towns would just totally flourish along the way. And people interested in buying land from the government, as the government had bought up a lot of this land along the railway. So miners seek fortune. We're going to talk about the miners during this time coming for gold and silver. The cowboys in the cattle kingdom, and how that brought in and using the trains to bring in more cattle, and actually to bring the cattle to the meat packs, and the meat packs to packings to be able to supply people with meat clear to the East Coast to the West Coast. Of course, farmers on the Great Plains needed the railroad system a great deal to bring in their farm supplies, and also to bring out their products and to sell their products to people on the East Coast, along the East Coast, but also in bringing them to be able to be shipped to foreign countries, as the farmers during this time would have surpluses in their crops. So, and on to the passing of the frontier, how gradually this big frontier would become filled with cities and towns and people flourishing along the way. Started going through by the wagon trains onto the railroads, bringing in more people. The frontier was vanishing. In 1860, virtually this frontier was uninhabited by white men, mainly just Indians. As they looked on in 1890, the frontier had vanished. That's only 40 short years. The Native Americans in the buffalo herds had started to disappear and be pushed away as the buffalo were hunted. The Native Americans depended on the buffalo for various things, for not only their food and shelter and clothing. A lot of those things came from the buffalo. And so we'll see how the Native American would have problems in the midst, and they too would start vanishing or being put on reservations. In 1890, there were the states, and there were 4 different territories in this area, and you'll see how many new states were formed during this time, especially when you think of 1890. I think from 1889 to 1890, there were 4 new states. So, miners. So let's talk about the miners. They were seeking fortunes for new wealth. In 1858, they found gold on Pikes Peak in Colorado. They called them the 59ers. Remember, the 49ers came to California as they found gold striked in California. Now they would find gold in Colorado, and this brought more miners. They'd say Pikes Peak or bust. You know, Pikes Peak is in Colorado. And many did bust and return home, but some struck it rich, and some became wage earners and stayed there and supplying the miners that would come in with different business opportunities, and food and saloons and all kinds of things would be very important to them, and that time would spring up, I should say, along these big boom towns. In 1859, the Sierra Nevada mountains near Lake Tahoe would bring in more gold and silver. Virginia City in Nevada would be a big center for silver mining. The Comstock lode brought in $300 million in silver in that 20-year period, which one at Virginia City, Nevada, would be this huge boom town in the midst of the Comstock lode of silver. In Arizona, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, these areas would all flourish with miners coming looking for gold and silver. Boom towns, like I said before, overnight would spring up, 5,000 or more. There was no really official law in these towns and order, so they would have to form their own law. And so they'd set forth and put in these vigilance committees, they called them, to maintain the peace. Later on, they would call them vigilantes. And they would bring in the criminals and there'd be swift punishment. A lot of times the outlaws, they would hang them right on the spot, so they were called vigilantes. And this was in these boom towns, as they didn't have police like we would have now today, or they had in the East Coast. So they put forth their own law. But most of them were law-abiding citizens and very respectable in a lot of these communities, although there were a lot of desperados, that's for sure, coming to find wealth in these boom towns, whether it be mining for gold and silver or just being there and supplying the miners with various things. Let's just say that. But later it was the easy access for the gold and silver ran out. So that meant as they were panning for gold, they didn't get very much gold anymore in the rivers. So they would have to leave it to the big mines, and only the big mines, and the big mines then would be owned, and the miners would come to work in the mines. But as the mines started running out of gold and silver, and basically slowing down those coming there, these towns, a lot of them turned to ghost towns, as everybody left the town and all was left with the shell of what was once a boom town. Cowboys in the cattle kingdom. Well, of course, cattle became very important. Of course, the buffalo, as we know, had been hunted, to almost extinction. But from the south, usually towards Texas, as years before the Spanish brought in cattle, at this time, beef became very important. At first, the ranges were very open range, and they'd come and gather the cattle and bring them in. The Texas Longhorns were mostly unowned cattle, and they were in South Texas. And they brought these up through Texas north into bringing them in so that they could bring them into certain meat packing places and sell the beef. In 1865, they were just valuable first for just their hides, but now there was a new demand of beefsteaks and such from the beef that they were bringing in. They were sold for $4 a head, and then they were sold 10 times that in the northern cities. So if they could get their cattle to the northern cities, they could make 10 times, so $40 a head instead of $4 a head. And the railroad now became very easy to get the cattle to the market and to get the beef, to when they finally had the refrigerator cars to get the beef to the market. So the meat packing houses flourished in certain towns such as Kansas City and Chicago. They would flourish in meat packing and grow. The city would grow as they brought in this cattle, and people would work in the slaughterhouses and in the meat pack. The long drive. Okay, you see here in this map where southern Texas, they would have to bring it all the way up to Kansas and then on to Chicago, to the meat packing. So this was a long drive to round up. First of all, they would lose a lot of these cattle, so they would want to brand their cattle, because sometimes they had to not only in losing, I wouldn't say losing, but combining. When they combined the cows together, they wouldn't know whose belongs to whose, right? And so they would lose their cattle to someone else. And so now they needed to combine these, so they started to brand them with their names. So they could have on each cow, they would know where that cow or who that cow belonged to. They would have a cowboy and a trail boss, and then they'd have a chuck wagon, and all these cowboys would be on the trail herding these cows all the way on this long trail, all the way up to Kansas. In fact, some of these trails would hold up to 1,000 to 10,000 cattle at one time. So from the Texas to the railroads in the north, they'd go up north to the railroads to put the cows on the railroads as they get up towards Kansas, or to the meat packing in Kansas City. One of the most famous trails, the one that's outlined right here, is called the Chisholm Trail. And you can see that trail, that's that trail from Texas on up to Kansas. And now if you go along there, you'll see these statues and monuments of what was once this famous cattle drive. Cow towns. So cow towns sprung up too. Some of the most famous cow towns were Abilene and Dodge City. Both of those are in Kansas. In Ogallala, Nebraska. In Cheyenne, Wyoming. So both of those in Ogallala and Cheyenne were cow towns too. But when you think of cow towns, I usually think of Dodge City, because cow towns became notorious for different fights and bandits and all these things. They were very rough areas, rough towns, these cow towns with the cowboys. In 1866 to 1888, 4 million heads of cattle were brought from Texas to the railroad. 4 million heads, that's a lot of cows. In 1880, the shift for cow towns went towards Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, onto the west to the Dakotas. All of these states had cow towns and where they brought cattle into the towns. But the big meat packing cities were in Kansas and Chicago. It was very important during this time to have a refrigerator car, and was invented during this time to ship fresh beef to the eastern cities, the refrigerator car. So here we have some pictures of these cow towns throughout. Some of these, a couple of them, Abilene, onto Dodge City, onto Ogallala and Cheyenne. The end of the open range. So the open range was prior and went on for like 20 years. And a lot of the railroads were near the ranches were open range. Now they were having problem, of course, because the cattle would cross areas of where the railroads ran. And also they brought in sheep, and they couldn't really mix the sheep with the cattle in these areas, so they needed to have fenced in land. And so they started fencing land and fencing water holes for the cattle and for the sheep, and to keep them off the railways from getting hit, right? And the smaller herds actually produced better quality of beef, and they had developed a lot of different varieties of cattle as they had smaller herds. And they would also have hay for winter, so they'd be able to bring in their herds as they do today in areas where they could eat hay, and they'd have exactly what they were going to eat, not just grass, but hay. And during the winter here, this area you see, this is actually one from today's era, I should say. And wells for water supply. Of course, the herds needed water to survive. But the big important invention during this time was barbed wire, as you can see down there, because the barbed wire would cause them to be able to put in these fences at low costs to keep in the herds of cattle from being on the open range. The farmers of the Great Plains. So it was first, before the farmers came in this area of the Great Plains, they called this the Great American Desert. And they basically thought the prairies at that time were unsuitable for crops. They thought this land could not be important. It would go on and on and on. They thought, oh, there's no way, we can't grow anything. But a few brave farmers plowed the fields, and they found that the soil was surprisingly fertile, and that they could especially grow a lot of wheat and corn in these areas. So then many settlers started moving west as they saw the prairies an opportunity for farming. The railroad extended to the west, so this is very easy for the settlers now to migrate to the prairies and to get their supplies and deliver their crops by railroads. But, of course, in a lot of these areas, as you go across the prairies of, Kansas and Oklahoma and onto Nebraska, onto Montana, these areas, they would have a lot of cold blizzards that come through. And so they'd have to build their homes so that they could survive, very cold times. Also, there'd be a lot of flooding in certain areas. They would have problems with locusts and grasshoppers, droughts. A drought would come in, and a year of drought would be devastating to a lot of these farmers. Prairie fires, too, and heat and storms, lightning and thunder and tornadoes during this time. So the life on the prairies became a pretty hard life in most sense, especially for new people, new settlers coming in. They'd have to be presented with a lot of these things that could cause major problems in their life and make their life more of a rugged life than they held on the East Coast or in Europe. The Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave 160 acres of land. They could settle this land. It was like a quarter section. All they had to do was simply live on this land for 5 years. They'd have to pay like $10 to have it recorded, but if they lived on the land for 5 years, they would settle that land, they could have that land. This was a big deal, the Homestead Act of 1862, and it brought in a lot of settlers. We can just say that. You can see from this picture. Here's the picture, Nebraska for sale, 1 million acres up for grabs. Our water, our wildlife, our way of life are all at stake. They really were trying to get people to come in and settle the land. And indeed they did. Building a home was not easy. So, because there was practically no wood on the prairies. And most of the time they'd have to have a dugouts, or as these pictures of here, or sod houses, these pictures. Dugouts is they dig right into the side of a hill or a ravine, underground, in that way, and put chunks of sod on the outside with the posts and the door in the front. The roof logs covered with brush, the roof would have logs covered with brush and prairie grass and dirt, as you see in those pictures. Sod houses were a little bit harder to build. They were 3 feet sod bricks. They put these sod bricks together with walls and mortar, and together they put this with adobe mud, and they mix this dirt and everything and make these bricks and build these so-called sod brick houses. And then, of course, the wooden frames and the door and the boards and the tar paper were all important things, even added to the sod house. So they had to have some wood involved in all of this. But these were the way the houses were built when the settlers first came to the prairies. Fuel, water, and food. So what did they eat? Well, a variety. But they could not always find a lot of fuel to burn in the midst. They would haul wood sometimes, but of course in the prairies they didn't have much wood, so they'd burn corn cobs and corn stalks and twisted hay instead. They would have to get water, so they would have to dig wells that were like 200 feet deep, which is quite a deep well. Corn would become very stable food because they could plant for corn, and sometimes they'd eat various types of corn 3 times a day. Coffee was not available, although they would make something that kind of looked like coffee, but that wasn't coffee, out of squash, carrots, pumpkin, and barley, and rye. Wonder what kind of coffee that was. They also would have sorghum molasses for their sugar. And wild honey, because there was a variety of honeybees on the prairie, and maple syrup. That's what they have for their sweeteners, I should say. They also could find some wild berries on many of the streams, and they'd hunt wild game in those areas too. This is what the settlers depended on for their fuel, water, and food. Technology on the prairies. Okay, they needed equipment, farm equipment. James Oliver, 1823 to 1908, in 1868, he built the chilled iron plow up here in the corner. Very important, plow during this time. Joseph Farwell, in 1813 to 1906, was an Illinois farmer, and he's the one I told you that built, put together, invented, I should say, the barbed wire fences. So important on the prairie for them to put forth their barbed wire and fence in their land to keep their animals and to divide up the land and know their borders with this barbed wire. The windmill in 1850 was actually put together or invented for the prairies, and it was used in the 1870s. They could purchase this windmill unassembled and ready to supply for water. And as soon as they got their well, they would use the windmill to pump the water out of the well. Otherwise, they'd have to go to the well and they'd have to, take the water out by hand. You know, as you go well, pull it out by hand with a pail. Now they could use the power of the wind with the windmill. So the windmill became very important on the prairie, especially because the prairies were very windy, On to irrigation. They would learn how to irrigate the land. They, of course, would need water in the midst of irrigation. They also, in certain areas that were prone to drought, they brought in this drought-resistant wheat. It was actually a type of Russian wheat that they brought in and planted that actually grew favorably on all of the prairie lands. And so now they could have this wheat, and you'd see fields and fields of wheat and this wheat would be able to survive on little water. In 1899, the Great Plains nations became the breadbasket of the United States of America. So because of this wheat, so much wheat was grown that now most people would make their bread from wheat that was grown in the Midwest, not only throughout the whole nation, but also in other lands. We'd be shipping foreign supplies of wheat to other lands. 4 out of 5 of the leading wheat-producing states were in the West. So, and Minneapolis became the largest of the flour mills in the world with wheat flour. So you can see some pictures there of the windmills and the wheat. The passing of the frontier. So as we can see, as more settlers moved to the west, the frontier would become less and less. And now we would see cities spring up all the way to the west coast, even through the prairie, even through the desert areas. Nevada, as you see the picture there, you can see the states that were admitted. Nevada was admitted to the Union in 1864. Nebraska was admitted to the Union in 1867. Here's Nebraska. You can see Nevada. Just look on your map here. Colorado was the centennial state in 1876. And between 1889 and 1890, 6 new states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. That's just 2 years. We have 6 states. And then, right after that 2-year period, Utah. In 1890, after the Mormon Church banned polygamy, basically the state of Utah said, no, you cannot have 2 wives or 5 wives. You only can have 1 wife, not more than 1 spouse. You know, when they passed that law, then Utah became a state in 1890. So you can see we have a variety. The territories were made up into states, and some of the states now are basically what they are today, right? All of the states now are what they are today. But later on in 1959, they would add Alaska and Hawaii. But you can see how the states were growing in the midst, from California in 1850, and you'll see that some of the last states, Arizona and New Mexico, were not until 1912. So, yes, the passing of the frontier. So, Oklahoma. Oklahoma was a crazy territory to be opened because Oklahoma was set forth for the whole state was a total Indian reservation. Remember the Trail of Tears? They brought the Indians into Oklahoma and said, this will be your land now. This is your reservation. Well, of course, that would not go on for long. In 1889, they opened Oklahoma Territory for settlement. The first people that were there were called the Sooners that came in, and they went and staked their land before it was even open. But on April 22nd, 50,000, they call them boomers, 89ers, because it was the year 1889, they lined the boundaries of Oklahoma. They lined the boundaries and waited until it was open so that the settlers at the boundaries, as they opened at high noon, the bugle would sound and the settlers would pour in, and they ran as fast as they could, or they rode their horses or their wagons, brought their wagons through, or however they could get in. They came in to stake their land in Oklahoma. It was quite a day, a most unusual day in history. In 1890, the territorial government in Oklahoma was set up. In 1907, Oklahoma would become the 46th state of the United States of America. Later on in 1912, we have New Mexico and Arizona. But the settling of the Oklahoma territory was most unusual because most of the settlers came in one day, 50,000 of them, all around the borders of Oklahoma, waiting for high noon so that they could come in and settle and stake their claim to the land. You can imagine how the Native Americans thought, sitting there watching them come and taking over the land that they were actually thought of, that they had owned themselves. So what a day. Quite a day in history. Oklahoma. So let's stop there.